sem ætlar að halda hér fyrir okkur smá fyrirlestur. En til þess að kynna hann með réttum hætti, þá höfum við formaður utanríkismálanefndar, Tómas Ingi Olrich, gera það. Gjörðu svo vel, Tómas.
Það mikil ánægja að fá hingað til okkar François Heisbourg, sem einn af þekktari sérfræðingum sem hefur starfað á vegum franskra stjórnvalda og vegum framkvæmdastjórnar Evrópusambandsins að ýmsum málum sem snerta öryggismál, alþjóðastjórnmál og hryðjuverka ógn. François Heisbourg fæddur 1949 og hann menntaðist í þessum skóla sem stjórnunarskóli franska ríkisins, École nationale d'administration. Hann á langan feril sem ráðgjafi í stjórnmálum. Hann starfaði í franska utanríkisráðuneytinu frá 1978 til 1984 og var þá meðal annars öryggis ráðgjafi utanríkisráðherra Frakklands. Hann var aðstoða framkvæmdastjóri stórar verksmiðju sem framleiðir einkum og sérlega vopnabúnað, Thomson, eftir að Mitterrand fósendi þjóðnýtti þessa verksmiðju. Og síðan var hann framkvæmdastjóri ISS, sem International Institute for Strategic Studies, sem stofnun sem hefur höfuðstöðvar sínar í London. Og François Heisbourg nú sem stendur stjórnarformaður í þeirri merku stofnun, International Institute for Strategic Studies, sem ein af undirstöðu stofnunum í upplýsingaöflun pólitísk og alþjóðleg stjórnmál og öryggismál. Hann gaf út nú nýlega bók sem heitir í endalok Evrópudrömsins. Það nauðsynlegt að láta það fylgja að François Heisbourg mikill stuðningsmaður Evrópusambandsins og vill sjá það þróast með eðlilegum hætti. Þessi bók mjög merkileg og hefur komið á miklum umræðum víða í Evrópu, í bæði sjónvarpi og í blöðum. Og hann mun að sjálfsögðu flytja okkur nú erindi sem byggt á þessari bók og áhyggjum hans af framtíð Evrópusambandsins. Professor Heisbourg, we are very pleased to have you here. I must say that you are among those experts that have the ability to lock together considerations in politics, in international affairs, security matters and terrorism. And I've been astonished by the way that you have streamlined all those considerations into one very powerful thought that we find in this book, La fin du rêve européen. So we are very pleased to have you here. It is not a very common thing to have good specialists talking about political strategies. It's very rare, unfortunately, but very important, however. I would like to give you the floor, and thank you for coming to us. Professor Heisbourg, please.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a great pleasure to come back here to Iceland. My last visit was just before everything blew up in 2008, so I also have a bit of an opportunity to see the contrast between the situation then and the situation now, and to make some comparisons also with our own experience in the Euro area, because you are not in the Euro, so to see how things have gone in two different cases is quite interesting. The future of the European Union, first a reminder of where the European Union has come from. It is a project, and I use that word quite deliberately, because it's quite unusual in the political life of nations and the peoples to have major political initiatives born not organically, but as a project. The United States of America was a project. The Soviet Union was a project. The European Union is a project. That in itself is an important dimension to take on board. Born of the wars, all three wars, World War I and World War II, as experiences never to be repeated, and the Cold War as a threat to be dealt with. Those three experiences were part of the birth of the project. The objective in the treaties, ever closer union. Ever closer union, leading in the fullness of time, not in the treaties, but in the language of the founding fathers of the 1950s, leading to the United States of Europe, les États-Unis d'Europe, through a particular method, that of, and I'll use French from time to time because in the creative stages of the Union, French was the language of choice, through the method of solidarité de fait. That is, you create a situation of de facto solidarity from which you can then draw new strides in political terms towards ever closer union. And also, as part of the method, the reliance on crisis to propel the project forward. Crisis viewed as challenge, in effect, an acceptance that problems generate solutions. This is also quite an interesting aspect of the whole project. And indeed, when you look at the various stages of the project, you will always find this sort of progression in a staircase. You have a rapid progression in the wake of a crisis or to deal with a crisis, then you have a plateau, and then you have a new step forward. This has been, until the crisis of 2008-2009, this is what characterized both the origins of the project and the nature of the project. Leading, in effect, to a powerful metaphor of which we have become a prisoner, the metaphor of the bicycle. The European Union is supposed to be like a bicycle. It can move forward, it cannot move backward. You can occasionally stop it, but you cannot drive very slowly. You're either riding forward at a given speed or you're not going forward at all. Here again, this image also, the staircase. That metaphor is one which has met its, I think, its end with the current crisis, and I'll come back to that. But these are the objectives, modus operandi, and the assumptions which have characterized the project during its first half century. A couple of other elements. I just said half a century. This is another way of saying that in political terms, time is not of the essence in this project. It is a project, but it's not time urgent. This is reasonable. To create a political project takes time, even if you can have rapid progressions at given moments. It took, for example, the United States of America about 70 years after their independence to have a single currency. The dollar became the US dollar in all of the states of the United States after the Civil War of 1861-65. They had to wait until the eve of the First World War to have a federal income tax and to have a Federal Reserve banking system, which is another way of saying, you know, time in these sorts of matters is not necessarily of the essence. And the last feature, absolutely crucial, but here again challenged by current situation, France and Germany at the center of the project. For two reasons, one which is obvious and another which is less so. The obvious reason was, of course, that the main military, strategic, political opposition during the First and Second World War was the one between France and Germany. And if this project was going to be driven in part by the deliberate turning the back to a period of conflict, well, it had to be driven by the two basic protagonists, antagonists. But there's another reason, which has also met its limits in recent years, and that is that France and Germany actually materialized the extremes of the differences which existed within the European project as to where the project should be going. Germany, from the very beginning, was deeply federalist, the Adenauer vision, and France was much more intergovernmental, l'Europe des patries, the Europe of the fatherlands of Charles de Gaulle. If these two countries could agree on something, there was little reason why the other member states would not find it possible to agree as well, because the differences between, let's say, the Italian vision and the Belgian vision of the Union were much less widely apart than between France and Germany. This has ceased to be the case, but it was a very powerful motor of European integration. France and Germany had decided together that whatever would happen, they would find a way to agree, and having found a way to agree on the way forward, others would willy-nilly follow. Second stage, the project develops. I'll go very quickly here to take as my basic turning point 1989. What happens in 1989? A big crisis called the end of the Cold War. Berlin Wall falls down. German unification becomes an operational prospect. Chancellor Kohl recognizes this. François Mitterrand recognizes this. And the two together decide that they are going to handle this in the old French-German way, that is, together. And so they meet, early December 1989, and out of that meeting comes a basic decision, which is there will be monetary union and there will be political union. Political union, that is, we will have a further move towards the United States of Europe. Germany will therefore be a united country within a united Europe, and monetary union, meaning that Germany abandons the hallmark of her national identity, which was the Deutschmark, and acquires subsumes that identity in the broader European identity, which in the monetary field will be encompassed by what will be known from 1995 onwards as the euro. This was the basic deal, which was a very positive deal on its own terms. That is, German unification and the handling of that massive project in the framework of the wider European project went smoothly, went easily. It's all very easy for us today to assume that all of this was going to happen very naturally and very easily. 1989, this was far from obvious. 500,000 Soviet soldiers in the center of Europe, Warsaw Pact members, deep divisions within Europe as between the two Germanys and so on. But Kohl and Mitterrand, from very different starting points, struck this deal and helped drive the unification process peacefully to a happy conclusion, as far as the unification of Germany is concerned. On the European side, it's a bit more complicated. European Union gets lost on the way. Monetary union proceeds with its various stages, and I'll come back to that in a second. But political union very quickly is set aside. The French are not as federalist as the Germans, traditionally, and therefore they do not press for the federalization process, which they themselves would normally have had an interest in promoting. And if they had had any temptation to press the process forward towards greater federalization, the manner in which the Maastricht Treaty, 1992-1993, was negotiated and then put to ratification. We had a referendum in France. The French voted yes, but they voted yes by a very narrow margin. And the signal was quite clear. The people were not ready for strongly federal moves. That's on the French side. On the German side, interest in promoting European Union also dissipates. There are immediate issues to deal with, notably the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, the beginning of the Balkans wars, and Germany finds it expedient to push her own agenda in terms of the handling of the declarations of independence of the former Yugoslav republics, notably the conditions under which Croatia was recognized. All of this sounds terribly outdated. I think most people have forgotten about that particular episode. But in practice, it meant that the steam for political union was running out even before it had really built up. The monetary project continues. But whatever the problems with political union, the European Union at that stage continues to expand. It expands territorially with the strategic success, formidable strategic success of the integration of the former members of the Warsaw Pact, of the 3 Baltic states, former members of the Soviet Union, a magnificent success by any standards. At the same time, although political union may have been in a rut, the competences of the European Union were broadening rapidly into the field of justice, into the field of home affairs, into all sorts of regulatory fields. We all know the statistic, although the statistic is actually quite difficult to check up, but somewhere around 60% of domestic legislation in EU member states is produced by the EU institutions, not by the institutions of the member states. So the growth of the normative empire, the peaceful growth of an empire, actually quite unprecedented in human history, and the project going up to Brest-Litovsk and Narva, all very impressive. Furthermore, at the end of the 90s, the Euro project gains traction. The markets from 95 onwards understand that the Euro is going to exist and it's really going to exist. And you have an immediate convergence of interest rates across the countries of the future Eurozone, and a convergence not towards the middle, but a convergence towards the German interest rates. And the spread between the German interest rates and the interest rates of even the weakest members of other members of the future Eurozone becomes microscopic. A few basis points, to speak the jargon. The markets had come to the conclusion that when the German government was selling the euro to the German people by saying that it was going to be stark wie die Mark, well, that actually, yes, it was going to be stark wie die Mark, strong as the Deutschmark in every sense, notably in terms of the implicit guarantee underpinning the borrowing, the sovereign borrowing of all members of the Eurozone. So End of the 90s, everything seemed to be going quite well, despite the failure of European Union, a political union. Another strong point, European security and defense policy starts to emerge with Britain under Tony Blair deciding that it was no longer going to oppose the development of the European Union's excursions into that field, which in turn made it possible to rationalize much of Europe's defense industry, for example. So here we are in the early 2000s, 12, 13 years ago, with a European Union which had the number of whose members had more than doubled, whose competences had greatly broadened, whose ambitions as a strategic actor on the global scene were beginning to emerge, and on top of everything else, we had fairly high growth, which everybody forgets. From 95 to 2000, average growth rate in the Eurozone, 3% a year. And that's not a rounded figure, by the way, that is the figure, 3%. Boy, what a dream. I think we could have 3% a year for 5 years. It makes it easier to have projects when you're doing 3% a year on a recurring basis. But the storm clouds were accumulating and were going to break out in rapid succession. First storm cloud, the Iraq crisis. Remember, Americans invade Iraq. 2002, the crisis begins. 2003, the Americans invade. The British then have to make a basic decision. If they go with the Americans in Iraq, they have to pull out all of their troops, practically all of their troops, from European military operations. And that is what happens. The British, in effect, cease to be an actor of consequence in European security and defense policy. Now, European security and defense policy without the Brits is a little bit like having the euro without the Germans. It's conceivable, but not very easy to handle. So, first harbinger of change, negative change. Second, bigger thunderstorm. The European Union decides that it has to put political union back on track. And we have what was then called the convention, the constitutional convention. The words were deliberately chosen to mirror what the Americans did in the 1780s, when they wanted to move from the very loose Articles of Confederation to the current Constitution of the United States of America. We were going to have our own constitution, constitutional convention. And in 2005, the ratification process begins. And we all know what happened, even if we have maybe forgotten it. 2 out of the 6 founding states, France and the Netherlands, vote clearly against the constitutional treaty. End of an ambition, end of a political ambition. This was before the crisis. Let's never forget that. Our peoples were not yet ready to go that far. I'm a federalist. And of course, I'm not happy with what happened at that time. But I also consider that these things have to be taken in their stride. Time, in political terms, time is not actually of the essence. Time can be of the essence for all sorts of other reasons, all sorts of other aspects. But in terms of developing a new polity in which the primacy of power would be at the union level rather than at the national level, that can take decades and decades and decades. And if you have to stop, maybe even go back a little bit, that's one could do that. It's better to do it that way than to have a big civil war like the Americans in 1861, 1865, which is indeed the manner in which they really produced the modern union. Maybe not a model to emulate if one can avoid it. Second storm cloud. Then the third storm cloud, the crisis, the global crisis. Now, we all know that crisis began somewhere in Southern California. And this is of course historically true. That is where it began. But what that crisis masked was that we had similar imbalances in the Eurozone, which were brought about by very different circumstances than those which provoked the subprime crisis in the United States of America. And here I get to the euro part of our discussion. When I said that the euro was being put together in the 1990s, it was done so in the full understanding by those who created the euro that we did not have the full set of institutions necessary to handle a single currency, nor the basic economic conditions which would make a single currency successful. We knew that. We had in place essentially only three things, sorry, actually. One, the European Central Bank, with a narrow mandate, which is still currently the case, even if it tends to push against the limits. The stability criteria of the Maastricht Treaty and the follow-on Stability Pact. That was destroyed by the Germans and the French in 2003. In order to make it possible for Schröder to do his Hartz reforms. The Germans did not do their reforms on the backdrop of a struggle against budget deficits. They did their reforms against the backdrop of budgetary stimulus through breaking the Stability Pact. That's a parenthesis which I open briefly now, because of course this is exactly the opposite of what the French or the Italians or the Spanish or others are invited to do by the Commission and by Germany, which is you have to do your Hartz reforms, but you have to do so in a deficit-cutting mode. So you add recession, you add recessive measures to recessive measures, since the immediate effect of such reforms is recessive, even if they are necessary in the longer run. Close of parentheses. During that same period in which the Stability Pact was disregarded, one country and one big country alone actually respected the Stability Pact. That was Spain. In 2006, 2007, just before this crisis broke out, we were saying, oh, this is a great country, it has a very strong banking sector, it has a great economy, it's booming, it has a budget surplus. It has a very low debt to GDP ratio, around 30% at the time. This was the poster boy of fiscal and financial rectitude, Spain, which is another way of indicating that something must have been very badly wrong in the project. But then, as I said, we actually knew that we did not have the federal tax base. We did not have the Treasury Department. We did not have the political and administrative tools to handle a single currency, nor was the Eurozone an optimal currency area. If we had some characteristics of an optimal currency area, it was not because of the euro in the Eurozone, it was because of the single market. Single market, which goes way beyond the Eurozone, as you well know here, the single market has indeed led to a much higher degree of trade integration within, and not only trade integration within the European Economic Area, thereby making it into something which could eventually become an optimal currency area. But in the Eurozone, you do not have a distinctly greater degree of trade integration than you do outside of the Eurozone. So why did it happen? Well, it happened because it had been decided to do it. And once the project was put in place, it seemed to work. It had very high growth rates in Ireland, in Greece, in Spain. Everybody said this is normal. These are poor countries which are rapidly adjusting to our levels. This was seen as a virtue. The creation of speculative bubbles in the countries I've just mentioned was considered as a good thing. It's not that they were ignored, but they were essentially considered as something positive. So if it's all positive, if it all seems to be working, why the hell would you worry about the minor problems that I indicated? And of course, you had the underlying assumption that, as in the past, the European Union would self-correct the deficiencies as a result of responding to crisis. There would be a crisis at some point or another, so-called asymmetric crisis. We would recognize it, and we would rise to the occasion, and we would create the relevant institutions and mechanisms to deal with it. Well, the problem is the crisis has arisen, it has been massive, and we are not rising up to the occasion. Yes, we have created new institutions, we have created new levels of integration, but what have we as an outcome? We have as an outcome a situation in which our electorates are being massively disaffected vis-à-vis the whole of the European project. On average, and the average is pretty well spread around. I mean, it's not as if we had very great divergences on this one. Between Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Poland. I set aside the United Kingdom for a second. Since the beginning of the crisis, the level of confidence, the level of positive views on the European Union, the level has dropped by an average of 20% over that period. Now, in some places, this drop took place from a high level, like in Germany. In other places, it started from a comparatively lower level. But in all places, it's been about minus 20%. And this is continuing. We have produced mass unemployment in the majority of the members of the Eurozone. We have created a north-south divide, which is extraordinarily dangerous because the mass employment involved, notably in Italy and in Spain, two large economies. That mass unemployment has now been going on for 5-6 years. And you know how it is. When people have never been at work, youth unemployment in Spain today is between 50 and 60%. Even if there's some black economy, it's still a very, very high level, 50, 60%. When you have never worked in your life, or when you have been out of a job for 5 years, you don't go back to the job market, not easily. And when the level of that unemployment has been 25% for 5 years, as is the case in Spain, you are going to have a very low growth economy for a very long time, whatever else is done or happens. This has been the result, and this is my fear. So, what should we be doing? What are the options? And if I may ask a question, what lessons are we to draw from what happened here? The options for us in the Eurozone and in the Union more generally. The first option, which I think is basically uncontroversial, but is not actually implemented, which is sort of strange, is that we should put in the European Union the future of the Union above the future of the Euro. I could say that this is an abstract formulation. Well, it's not abstract, because in strategy, you must never forget what is your main aim point. The Euro is not, in and of itself, the European project. What is the European project? Is the European Union. And if in order to save the Euro, you are led to conduct policies which turn your electorates against the Union or against the freedoms within the Union, then you are clearly doing something wrong. And this we see happening as the 4 freedoms are actually being challenged in various countries of the Union. So EU first. That's the simple one to formulate, if not necessarily very easy to implement in practice. Now the options on the Euro per se, because one I've just indicated applies to all, or should apply to all members of the European Union. On the Euro, there are essentially 3 options. One is unavailable, that's federalism. That's the one I would prefer, but I recognize that it's unavailable. The politician, because in order to have federalism, you need a strong federal tax base. and the political institutions to run that tax base. That means a change of government and of the center of gravity between the nations and the federation. The politician who in Paris or in Berlin or in Rome who is ready to stand up on the box and say, oh yeah, we're going to give more power to the people in Brussels. Look at how well they've done over the last 6 years. We're going to give them not only more power, but we're going to give them much more money, like 10% of GDP, which I think would be about the level necessary to have a serious federal tax base. That politician's career would be over before the end of the speech. This is not going to happen within 10, 20 years. And it's not on offer. And when you look at the European elections that are going to take place next May, nobody is making that federal offer. You have think tanks which make the federal offer. But I always tell them, yeah, this is nice, this is what I want. But if no politician feels it possible to take up that offer, it must be that there is a problem. Because, well, you are politicians. Politicians actually do respond to the electorate. I mean, if they don't, their half-life tends to be quite short. Second option, we continue to do what we're doing with some variations. That is, we are in a situation which is not of immediate explosive crisis. Mario Draghi saved the euro last year by threatening outright monetary transactions, the monetary equivalent of nuclear deterrence. It worked. And furthermore, because the markets often played against the euro in 2010 to 2012, they have lost, many operators have lost quite a lot of money playing against the euro. Well, you know, markets are very primitive animals. They're very powerful, but they're very primitive. And if they get burnt, they're going to stay away from the fire for a long time. And they got burnt. So they're going to stay away from the fire of attacking the euro for quite some time. So we have a few years to play with. The euro is not going to explode like it threatened to explode half a dozen times between early 2010 and the middle of 2013. So you could say we continue to do this. The problem with that one is two things. One which is fairly obvious, and the other one which is much less so. The obvious thing is that the electorates are getting very, very tired of policies which are not producing results. Very low growth. If I look at the IMF and Commission's forecast for this year and 2015, 1%, a bit more than 1%, this is, while the rest of the world is moving, not great. Unemployment, well, we're stuck somewhere at 12% at the average Eurozone level. And somewhere, someplace, sometime over the next few years, there will be a political, social explosion in a significant country. That's the obvious one, which may not happen, although I think it will. But the less obvious one, not so tricky. And that is, while we have been talking and doing more integration, creation of the European support mechanism, the increase in the powers of the Commission to supervise our budgets, national budgets, and so on, while all of these things are happening, we are witnessing a renationalization of our banking systems and of our domestic and of our sovereign debts, which is very, very impressive. The French banks, for example, the big four, as we call them, used to be global players. They're now essentially national players. Ditto in Germany. You look at the evolution of the Commerzbank and the Deutsche Bank. And in Italy, it always was the case. That is even more so the case today with UniCredit. And in Spain also, it's very spectacular. So you take those economies, the banking sector, financial sectors are essentially national, have become essentially national. The Italian sovereign debt looks a lot more like the Japanese sovereign debt than used to be the case. In Spain, the same process is taking place both at the private and at the sovereign debt levels. Conclusion, it will be technically and operationally relatively easy for countries like Spain or Italy to withdraw from the euro if and when they see that as being a rational choice. And I don't know whether that will be the case, but when people see what is going on with Abenomics in Japan, 220% debt to GDP ratio, and they do stimulus. Wait a second, this is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do in the Eurozone. Well, maybe it won't work, but still they appear to be trying. When I look at what Renzi is trying to do in Italy, there are certain elements of that. So that could lead us to the third option, the one which I put forward in my book, which is the graceful, the orderly unraveling of the euro. I don't criticize our statesmen or stateswomen for having given the priority in 2010, 2012 to the prevention of the cataclysmic breakup of the Eurozone, because that would have destroyed the European Union and it would have destroyed the single market and the four freedoms, very clearly. But precisely because we are not in immediate crisis, because we have a bit of time, we can start thinking about now, how do we shift from the single currency to a common currency, which we had during a brief period of time between 95 and 99 with the ECU, the European Currency Unit, which was our currency of account, coexisting in the banking sector with our national currencies. In conclusion, because I'd like to hear you guys a little bit, do I believe that this orderly unraveling of the euro will be brought about politically? I wish I could say yes with some degree of confidence, but given the amount of political capital which has been invested in the euro, I fear that we're going to continue to try to continue what we're doing now, or have been doing for the last 5-6 years. That is deficit cutting as the priority, with reforms, structural reforms, necessary structural reforms being undertaken against that recessionary backdrop. And, of course, a euro which will continue to be completely suboptimal, because we have not become an optimal currency area as a result of the euro existing. Some people thought that simply by having a single currency, that the lineaments of an optimal currency area would be created. What the optimal currency area is one in which workers freely move from one part of the area to the other, goods, capital, services are freely traded, and the fact that there's a single currency increases all of these elements in comparison to what would happen without a single currency. Well, when I look at Sweden, when I look at Czech Republic, when I look at Poland, when I look at Britain, to take very different economies, well, they are doing quite as well as Eurozone economies when it comes to the movement of people, goods, services, and capital, which is another way of saying that the euro is not playing its role as creating the sort of optimal currency area which would be required to sustain it with or without a federal project. So there we are. Lessons, broader lessons. I don't know what is going to happen with Scotland. I assume that they're going to stay within the United Kingdom, and I may be wrong. I don't know what is going to happen with the British referendum on the European Union. I think chances are stronger than I was fearing in my book that the British will stay in, because the Labour Party has managed to put itself in a situation where it would not automatically do the same sort of referendum as the one which David Cameron has promised in the case his party is returned to power, as it may be in the elections next year. But there are a couple of things which I do know. The first is that the single market, the four freedoms, the refusal to consider the use of force in regulating relations between member states of the Union, that all of these things are worth preserving. That we would be much worse off if none of these things existed, and they only can exist if there is a European Union, and if they are broadened in some instances to other countries, like as in the European Economic Area or in the Schengen area, and you are in both, it is because there is a union. That is one thing I know. Second thing I know is that we are facing strategic challenges which are becoming more acute with a weaker United States, and therefore that we're going to have to concern ourselves more with the ability of the Union to operate coherently, cohesively vis-à-vis challenges in the Mediterranean, in the Russian area, north, east, and south, if I can put it that way, which also makes the case for a strong European Union. And the last thing, which I think I know, but here I speak very much under your control. When I look at positionings vis-à-vis the Union, in a way, I have the impression that you have put yourself in the worst of positions. That is, you are fully integrated in the European Economic Area, with all that that means, but you are not in the European Union, and when things go wrong, the European Union, like all other bodies, tends to take care of its own first. So when things went wrong in 2008 here in Iceland, and when there were strong reactions from the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, you had no defenders whatsoever within the Union. Nobody was going to expend political capital in your favor. Whatever the rule book about the European Economic Area was supposed to mean. If you are in the economic area, it is better to be in the European Union. I don't know whether the other option, which is to be like Switzerland, that is not to be in the economic area, but to be in a bilateral relationship with the Union, is a good one for a country like yourself. Switzerland has great difficulties in handling its bilaterals with the EU, but at least it has its geographical positioning, which makes it very difficult for the European Union to ignore. And although the balance between the Union and Switzerland is very much in disfavor of Switzerland, Switzerland still has that leverage flowing from its very particular geographical situation between France, Italy, Austria, Germany. You do not have that. And you have a population which is 1/25 the size of the population of Switzerland. And an economy which is also about that proportion of the Swiss economy. So I'm not sure that you would do very well in a strictly bilateral negotiation. Voilà, I've thrown a few provocations on the table. I've been a bit long, but then it was a big topic. Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Heisbourg, thank you very much for your speech. It's very interesting. But now we have some time for Q&A. And I'm sure some of you have already made up some questions that you really need to get some answers to. So, who would like to start? Well, then I'm going to start. You talked everything, also what he said about Iceland. Well, I'm thinking about the unemployment rates, which are high in the Eurozone. And we here in Iceland, we are not used to having high employment rates. So that is one of the topics that we have talked a little bit about when we talk about EU and Iceland, if we should join. Do you think, is it your opinion that if Iceland would have joined the EU, we would also have those high employment rates? Some people here in Iceland are followers of the euro. They really like the euro, and they admire the euro. And they say that the crisis would have been avoided in Iceland, or at least not as hard for us if we would have had the euro. And now we have some questions regarding Iceland and EU in Iceland, in Iceland, and people who are on that have that opinion about the euro. They think that the euro is the answer to our crisis, or all our economic problems would be dealt with if we would get into the EU and take up the euro. And in some way, the question about if Iceland should join the EU is all about the euro, but not about what the EU is. Is that a simplification of the topic, or do you think that this is the big topic that we should be talking about in Iceland? Maybe we should just start with those two, and Thomas, maybe add one from you.
I'll speak from here.
Yeah, I'm going to allow Thomas to bring in another question. Thomas?
Professor, there are some historians that believe that the crisis of the capitalism that happened in 1929 was followed by an intense crisis of democracy. In your book, you talk a lot about, you write a lot about the lack of democratic mandate in the European Union. You talk about the democratic deficit. Do you think that this problem is understood and dealt with within the European Union, or do we have the feeling, as I have, that nobody is really much concerned about this weakening of the democratic basis in the European Union? We know now that many of the basic decisions are taken by technocrats that are not elected and will never face their electeds.
We're going to start with those questions, and then we have at least two more, and I will close. We don't have much time, so please give me a signal now if you want to raise a question.
Happy to respond. I'll take them in this order, if I can put it that way. First of all, the what-if question, that is, if Iceland had been in the euro, and I say the euro, not simply the EU, would things have been less painful than they have been here? Now, I don't know Iceland well enough to make a judgment as to how difficult it was here, but I have seen what has happened in Ireland. And in the case of Ireland, although the Irish are rightfully proud of the manner in which they have met adversity, in the same way that I think that you are rightfully proud of the way you handled yourself in adversity, God, it's been one hell of a bad trip, including the sequels. When you meet senior civil servants, politicians, senior management people who tell you that their salaries today are minus 25 or minus 30% of what they used to be, that their kids are earning a living in Australia, South Africa, or the United States of America. Now I can tell you this is an old Irish tradition, but as one Irish person told me in a recent trip, we were shown what paradise could look like during 10 years, and then the doors were slammed in our face. It would be interesting to do a comparative study in the economic, political, and social disruption between Ireland and Iceland. There are two island economies and so on. it does not seem to me that Ireland was noticeably better off in terms of its outcomes than was the case in Iceland. There is, however, one big difference, and which will lead me to your first question, and that is that Ireland was a member of the European Union, and that Ireland did manage to defend her interests in the framework of the European Union in a manner in which Iceland was not able to defend its own interests. And that part of Ireland's problems flowed from a purely national decision, which was for a rather corrupt and incompetent political class to take the decision at the beginning of the crisis to have the taxpayer take over the liabilities of all of the banking sector of Ireland. Nobody asked them to do that, certainly not the Commission. And therefore, Ireland's troubles were greatly aggravated by a national decision. Now, would Iceland have done the same thing under similar circumstances? I do not know. The fact is that you didn't, under the circumstances that were yours. But still, Ireland was a very, very rough ride. So the case is not absolutely obvious that being part of the euro would have made your life any easier. However, being in the European Union does not mean necessarily being in the euro. And that is, I think, one of my basic points. We tend to forget that although the single currency is an EU project, not all EU members want to be part of that project, have opted out, Denmark and the United Kingdom, or have, like Chastity under St. Augustine, decided that of course they were in favor of the euro, but not now, Lord, much later, much later, that's Sweden. And others, and Poland may actually be working towards that direction as well, because if there's one thing which Poland noticed is that how well it did during the crisis by keeping her own monetary competence. And although there are strong strategic reasons for Poland to be in on every EU integration process, including the euro, the fact is that from an economic standpoint, Poland benefited enormously from being in the Union, but not in the euro. And that is, if you look at the European Union, look at Sweden, look at Poland, don't look at the euro, if I can put it that way. That's the piece of advice that I would tend to give. Is this impossible to bring about in negotiations with the EU? I do not know. It would have to be tested. But the fact of the matter is that you have a pretty strong empirical case to make about wanting to avoid to find yourself in a monetary union, given what has happened to other members of the union during the crisis of the eurozone in the crisis. Capitalism, the crisis of democracy after in the wake of the crisis. There is a general disaffection vis-à-vis democratic institutions in Europe today. And when I remind people in the Union, institutions, of some of the figures which I mentioned earlier on, they say, yeah, but at the national level it's the same thing, decreasing levels of trust and so on. And they're right, by the way. There are decreasing levels in our democratic institutions in all of our countries. But of course, that lack of trust is tightly linked to the lack of performance since the beginning of the crisis. And that lack of performance flows very directly from the policies that we put in place, which explain why Europe and no other part of the world, not even aging Japan, have had as rough a ride as we have had during the last 6 years. And for me, the crisis in the European Union, in democratic terms, is less about institutions than about first of all, performance, which I mentioned, but also in terms of the manner in which our peoples see themselves. Our peoples continue, and I use the word in the plural, very deliberately, our people still see the nation state as the main repository of democratic legitimacy, not the EU institutions. That may change, and it may change in a strange way during the next European elections. Let me explain. When the European Parliament went to universal suffrage in the late 70s, the participation rate in EU parliamentary elections was 60% in the Union of the time, the nine member states of the Union. At every single EU parliamentary election since then, that is over the last 35 years now, the participation rate has gone down, even as new members joined the European Union, of whom one would normally have expected a high participation rate because this was new, this was the project into which they had just bought, etc. Nothing doing, the participation rate has now gone down to around 40%. It will be very interesting to see whether in the next elections in May we will have an increase or a decrease of the participation rate. If there is an increase in participation rate, this will be bad news politically, but it will be good news in terms of democratic legitimacy. Let me explain that. It will be bad news because it will mean that people will have voted in favor of extremist parties, that they will have been mobilized, energized to vote for the National Front in France, the Cinque Stelle in Italy, Geert Wilders' party in the Netherlands, UKIP in the UK, etc. Which is obviously, these are not great parties, to put it very mildly. But conversely, of course, if for the first time in 35 years people are actually voting as Europeans, that in itself would give a ray of hope in the emergence of something which would look like a European people, a demos, a European demos. But I wouldn't hold my breath. I think that we may well have the worst of two worlds, that is a strong showing by the extremist parties, but no increase in the participation rate. That's my forecast for what it's worth.
Okay. Well, we will, of course, try to follow the news, what will happen in the elections.
We'll know within 5 weeks whether I'm right or wrong.
Then we will call you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But our time is up, but I want to suggest that we take 2 more questions, if that's okay with you. 3 short questions then. Björn.
Yes, thank you very much for this excellent overview of the papers and what you have been telling us. And you pointed out that Iceland would have been better off within the Union probably than having the EA agreement because of the Dutch and the British attitudes towards Iceland and towards Iceland. But in the end, we took the case to a court, and it was obvious that in the court we had the legal options on our side, so we were very well off, so to say, and so to speak, when we think about our position, our legal position, whatever happened politically. And as you said, that the Irish, well, what happened politically for the Irish and economically, well, they have gone through great difficulties, and we might have been faced with even greater difficulties within the EU, and the afterplay would have been much more difficult for us than it has proved to be in recent years here. Then, when you say that we could apply for EU membership without applying for Euro membership, that is the main argument in Iceland for applying for EU membership has been that we should get the Euro. So then you are, at the same time as you are saying that we are worse off not being members of the European Union, you are destroying the main argument for those who want us to join the Union. So this shows how special our situation is. What I wanted to ask you about area within the Union. And now you have a new government that want to have a new agreement with the Commission on budgetary regulations and so on and so forth. And you have the Germans on the other side saying that the French have already had their options, and they have to get their house in order with more favors from the Union. And you have a new economic minister that is hostile to the Union. How do you see this? You were predicting things about Southern Europe and so on. So when you look at your own country and its position within the Union, how do you see the next few weeks here?
Yep.
Og Gulli?
Thank you very much for your inviting speech here. Several points I would want to talk about, but I think I don't have another half hour to speak.
You don't.
Concerning the participation rates in the next election, I think in the UK you will see high participation rates just because they have local elections at the same
Yeah.
time as European elections. So you will probably see a rise in turnout, voter turnout there. However, generally in European studies it's acknowledged that the first decision without popular consent on behalf of the European Union has been the Maastricht Treaty. And since then there has been decisions made consequently without popular consent, so there is no popular ownership to the development of the European Union. And so there should perhaps maybe be no surprise that it has become more an ownership of the politicians rather than the electorate. And this connected to the thing that you said about the European Union helping their own first. Now several countries have received help: Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Greece. But in all those countries there's a lot of political dissent. So even receiving this help, it has created a lot of political instability. So my question is, how do you propose that a political project be continued that has no real democratic legitimacy and without popular consent, without having to disassemble some of the basic institutions?
Takk fyrir, svo síðasta hérna aftast gjörðu svo vel.
Thank you, Professor. I have the same observation as the other one as to how the situation is in Iceland, but the fact that you have managed in your presentation to destroy the argument for going into the EU with a large settlement for the Icelandic people, basically the employers who made quite a lot out of that possibility of using the euro to strengthen Iceland's weak economic situation. So I'd like to find out if you would tomorrow in a different group of people make that sort of assertion also, because it would be interesting. You would be having a totally different, more broader view coming from that group, mostly European supporters, I would think. The second point is the deficit in democracy. I mean, given this low participation of 10, 18, 20% in European parliamentary elections, what is your view with trying to rectify that in the future if this becomes such an albatross around Europe of bringing back the democracy, parliamentary democracy to the national parliaments?
Okay.
Okay. First, the democratic legitimacy. I agree entirely with everything that you said, and I would have gladly have said it myself if I had time to do so. Simply one point I would add to what you said about Greece, Spain, and so on. Well, when the euro was created, it was supposed to reinforce stability as well as creating more prosperity. On both counts, it has definitely not contributed to either. And indeed, there is a counterfactual which can be made fairly easily, and I think convincingly, that if Spain, Italy, and Greece and Portugal and Ireland had their national monetary instruments of the previous years, the problems that they would have had in the crisis would have remained national and non-systemic in nature. That we would not have the incredibly tense situation that we have, for example, today in Greece. That for me really does make the case that the European Union went one bridge too far with the euro. If we had not had the euro, things would not have been as difficult. It would not have been easy. And we know what happens when you have fluctuating exchange rates, as we did in the years previous to the euro. But we also know that we did never get 6 years of unadulterated recession, mass unemployment, and risk of systemic crisis every 2 months, as we have had. That's the albatross. We have to get that albatross off our neck, to pick up that expression, and that expression again. Before I get to France, on which I'll end, a quick point on Ireland, Iceland. Ireland obviously was a victim of the euro in the sense that the existence of the single currency played a major role in building up the massive imbalances which propelled the Irish real estate bubble to incredible heights, exacerbated the fragility of the country as a whole, as well as contributing to the corruption of the political class. And in that sense, yes, Ireland was worse off by having the euro, since it's the euro which made that particular crisis in Ireland possible. But once Ireland was in a deep mess, Ireland was treated, compared actually to other EU countries, with a certain degree of understanding by the EU, notwithstanding the EU's wrong-headed policies of what I call dual austerity, deficit-cutting austerity on the one hand, structural adjustment austerity on the other. Ireland was not mistreated by the European Union in the way that Iceland was mistreated. And you guys were mistreated. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You had as events proved, you had a pretty good case in law. There are trivial expressions in America about what happens to the law under certain circumstances. Had you been a member of the European Union, it would not have been so easy to disregard you. That I think is pretty clear. And you are not part of the club. Now, being part of the club does not guarantee you from wrong-headed policies, but at least it does provide some protection from the punitive national policies of one member or 2 member states against another member state, which was your problem. You had a problem with the Brits and a problem with the Dutch. I don't think this could have happened in the same way had you been a member of the European Union. I don't think the Brits would have dared do to you what they did to you with the anti-terrorism law and that sort of stuff. And as for the contribution of the single currency to your economic development, once again, let's take successful countries, not unsuccessful ones. Compare Sweden and Finland, 2 very comparable countries in many ways, in terms of their relationship to the EU, in terms of their relationship to Germany, in terms of the nature of the economic development, in terms of their priorities in the social arena, the reforms that they've done and so on. Which one is doing better? Both in terms of export performance and in terms of economic growth. Actually, Sweden is doing a bit better. Not massively better, it's actually doing somewhat better. Would Sweden be signally better off if it were a member of the euro? It's not an easy case to make. And indeed, when the question has been put to the Swedes, the Swedes answered no. I have not mentioned Denmark too much because Denmark has a peg to the euro. Whether that has been good to the Danish economy is actually quite questionable. Would Denmark have done better had they acted like Sweden or like Poland? Question. I don't know what the answer is, but it's not obvious that Denmark's economic performance has been helped by the fact that it has a currency pegged to the euro. France.
Yeah.
Well, France.
Forget France.
Oh my goodness, this hurts my head. I'm sorry. We are in a really big political mess. Now, to put things in order, economically, we are subjected to what in political science people call cognitive dissonance. That is, we have on the one hand the Commission, our elites, particularly the top business leaders and part of the political class, and the Commission in Brussels and the Germans who are telling us deficit reduction has to be the absolute priority. You signed on to the Stability Pact, the 2012 Pact. You have to abide by it. This has to be the absolute priority, and do structural reform as well. Then you have the markets, who tell us exactly the opposite. The markets tell us, you're doing fine, guys. We will continue to reduce your interest rates. We will continue to reduce your spread vis-à-vis the German 10-year bonds. On Monday, after our municipal elections, and a couple of hours after our statistical office indicated that our deficit in 2013 was even worse than had been expected, that it was minus 4.3% instead of the expected 4.1, which itself was worse than the 3% which we are supposed to have been doing vis-à-vis the Stability Pact. What did the markets tell us? Oh, you get another interest rate decrease to 2.14%, and with only 54 basis points vis-à-vis the German bond. If you're a politician, what do? You do like in Yes Minister, you act courageously, and you do reforms and lose the next election, or you do the sensible thing, which is you pretend to do reforms, but you don't actually do them. How many politicians are Churchillian? And being Churchillian is easier when you don't have elections, by the way, which was the case during World War II. So we have that slight dissonance. Now, all sorts of people tell me the markets can change their mind on a dime, which happens to be true. They can. But since these people have been saying that for the last 4 years, politicians cease to believe them. And so the politicians are actually quite rational. They pretend to reduce the deficit, and they actually don't. And by pretending to reduce, not reducing, we have managed to avoid outright recession. That is, we did 0.1% last year. Germany did 0.3%. We did marginally worse than Germany, but we did not do -4, -5 like Italy or Spain or Greece. And it's been the same story in the previous years. We've actually managed to be at the exact geometric center of the Eurozone average. We have the same unemployment rate as the average of the Eurozone. We have the same growth rate as the average of the Eurozone. We are probably the only country for which the euro, in terms of parity, is probably at the right level. And interest rates, of course, have never been so low. So that's the economic side and its political effects. Now, in the government, when we have a president who is institutionally much more powerful than the prime minister. We have a young prime minister, energetic, who clearly wants to act like Matteo Renzi in Italy. But the president is much more conservative in his outlook. He belongs much more to the deficit, pretending to cut the deficit school than to anything else. He's not, when I compare somebody to Renzi, that's a compliment. Because Renzi is actually doing, or seems to be doing what Schröder did, that is, substantial structural reform. He destroys the Italian Senate on Tuesday, and on Wednesday he kills one level of administration, the provinces. It's fairly brutal reform, far-reaching, and it will probably extend to the job market and so on. Good stuff. And at the same time, he's telling Brussels, just stop breathing down my neck on budget targets. This is not of the essence. What is of the essence is structural reform. It's not the deficit. And I think that is the inclination of Valls, the Prime Minister. Montebourg is another story. Montebourg, I don't think he's anti-EU, but I'm not sure he believes in the four freedoms. Now you can rightly tell me that there's a slight contradiction between those two statements, but I don't think he perceives that. He perceives the existence of that contradiction. That somehow you can have the EU without having the four freedoms. That's no. That is literally not good, and that's going to create a problem. So prospect. Prime Minister will try to do his stuff. The President will prevent him, and after a year he will leave the government furious, and he will run against Hollande in the next presidential elections, and somebody from the right will win the elections. And since the right, unfortunately in France, is as brain dead as the left, it's not going to be great.
European Parliament and the national parliament. Can we revert back to the national parliament?
This may happen in the Eurozone. That is, you have a number of people in groups like the Kliniker Gruppe in Germany or the Groupe Eiffel in France who've been writing papers with some influence on some policymakers in both Germany and France. Since the federal option is not approachable in the EU, maybe we can try it in the Eurozone, and because the European Parliament is not recognized as a legitimate body by the electorate, maybe we could have power restored to the national parliaments, the European delegation part of the national parliaments, and to have them act as a sort of Eurozone parliament. So it could happen that way. I don't think it will, because I don't think these groups have enough resonance in the national systems to move people like Merkel or Hollande. But the idea is there. It's not. It's part of the intellectual landscape.
Well, Professor, it's been an honor to be here with you today, and your lecture has been very interesting. And now we know all about France and, of course, of the Euro and EU. But við erum hér með úrdrátt úr bókinans sem fundarmenn geta tekið með sér heim. Bara takk, Thomas, fyrir að útbúa hann fyrir okkur mjög áhugavert. But in the end, I think we should just give him our thank you with our traditional way in Iceland.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I grab one of these?
Yes, of course you can.
Because I would be wanting to give one to your Prime Minister.